The first time Cole Hargrove told a joke in the saloon at Dusty Creek, every woman in the room either rolled her eyes or pretended not to hear him, and then Maggie Calloway laughed so hard she nearly knocked her coffee clean off the counter. It was the autumn of 1878, and Dusty Creek, Texas sat at the edge of nowhere in particular, the kind of town that existed because the railroad had paused there long enough for a few stubborn souls to drive stakes into the ground and call it home. The streets were unpaved. The wind carried dust into everything from your coffee cup to your Sunday best, and the population hovered somewhere around 400 people, depending on whether you counted the drifters who passed through on their way to bigger ambitions. There was a general store run by a man named Horace Beale, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a doctor's office that smelled permanently of carbolic acid, and the Lucky Strike Saloon, which despite its name had never once produced any luck for anyone who frequented it on a regular basis. Cole Hargrove had ridden into Dusty Creek 3 weeks before that autumn morning, arriving with a bedroll, a bay gelding named Fletcher, a battered leather saddlebag, and the particular kind of reputation that preceded quiet men who had seen too much of the harder edges of the frontier. He was 28 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent their lives outdoors became weathered, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had a habit of observing everything before committing to any expression whatsoever. He had worked cattle drives up from the south, done some range riding for a rancher in New Mexico territory, and most recently had served as a deputy in a town called Carterville before that town had essentially dissolved when the silver mine collapsed and the population scattered to the winds. He had come to Dusty Creek looking for steady work because he had heard, along the trail, that the Rocking H Ranch east of town was hiring capable hands ahead of the winter. He had presented himself to the ranch owner, a gruff and practical man named Edwin Hollies, and Edwin had hired him on the spot after watching Cole handle a spooked horse with more patience than most men would have bothered with. So Cole had settled into the bunkhouse with 3 other ranch hands, a fellow named Pete Dawson who was 50 and had seen everything twice, a young man named Clarence Webb who was 19 and had seen almost nothing and was desperately trying to correct that, and a quiet Tejano cowboy named Rafael Medina who spoke little but worked harder than any 2 other men combined. Cole was not, by any honest assessment, a gregarious man. He did not seek out company for its own sake, and he was not the type to hold court in the saloon with loud stories about his exploits. But he did have one particular quality that surfaced unexpectedly and at the strangest moments, which was a dry, understated sense of humor that caught people completely off guard, because it came from a face that looked as though it had forgotten what smiling felt like. His jokes were the quiet kind, the kind that took a second to land, delivered with such a straight face that you were never quite sure he meant them to be funny at all. And in a place like Dusty Creek, where life was hard and humor was mostly of the rough, obvious, slapping-your-knee variety, Cole's particular brand tended to fall completely flat. Pete thought he was just strange. Clarence usually laughed a beat too late, more out of social obligation than actual amusement. Raphael would occasionally give a small, private smile that suggested he understood, but was too dignified to show it fully. Edwin Hollies had told Cole, after one such remark, that he had no idea what Cole was talking about, but that it was fine as long as he kept the horses fed. And the women of Dusty Creek, on the rare occasions Cole ventured into town, and the even rarer occasions he said something even remotely intended to be amusing, looked at him the way women tend to look at men who are trying too hard to be charming, which is with the polite blankness of someone waiting for the actual point to arrive. So when Maggie Calloway laughed, really and truly laughed, it was so unexpected that Cole forgot what he had even said and simply stood there for a moment with the strange sensation of a man who has been speaking into empty air for years and has suddenly, inexplicably, been heard. Maggie was 24 years old and had been in Dusty Creek for nearly 2 years, having come from a town in Tennessee with her father, Thomas Calloway, who had harbored the dream of running a newspaper on the frontier. Thomas had managed to establish the Dusty Creek Courier, a 4-page weekly that reported on local affairs, cattle prices, weather, and the occasional scandal with equal enthusiasm. The paper was modest but genuine, and Thomas Calloway was a man of genuine conviction who believed that even the smallest town deserved a voice in print. Maggie had come to help him, having learned typesetting and basic editorial work from her father throughout her adolescence, and she had stayed because her father's health had begun to decline in ways that made it clear he needed her, and because somewhere along the way she had found that she actually loved the work. She was not the most beautiful woman in Dusty Creek, if beauty was measured by the standards that men in saloons applied to it, which tended toward a particular kind of deliberate feminine presentation that Maggie found more exhausting than interesting. She was of medium height, with dark red hair that she usually wore pinned up in a practical way that regularly failed to contain it entirely, so that strands were always escaping around her face. Her eyes were green, not the pale, uncertain green that some people have, but a clear, definite green that made her feelings obvious to anyone paying attention. She had ink stains on her fingers more often than not, and she wore dresses that were good quality but chosen for durability over fashion, and she walked through Dusty Creek with the purposeful stride of someone who always had somewhere specific to be. She was, in the assessment of most of the men in town, not the type of woman you tried to impress with bravado or fancy talk. She had a directness to her that some men found intimidating and others found simply refreshing, and she had an intelligence that showed immediately in conversation, and that made foolishness uncomfortable in her presence. She was also, though she would never have described herself this way, genuinely kind in the way that only people who have observed enough human suffering to understand it without being crushed by it can be kind. The morning she laughed at Cole Hargrove's joke, she had been at the counter of Horace Beale's general store, collecting paper and ink supplies for the newspaper office, when Cole had come in to purchase tobacco for Pete, who had sent him into town on the errand because Pete's knees were giving him trouble that morning. Cole had been standing at the counter waiting for Horace to finish with another customer, and Maggie had been standing beside him doing the same, and they had exchanged the polite nods of people who vaguely recognize each other without having formally met. Then Horace, who was a man of approximately 7,000 words on any given subject, had begun a lengthy explanation about why the particular type of paper Maggie had ordered had not arrived on the expected supply wagon, and the explanation had involved weather, and the wagon driver's personal habits, and the supplier in San Antonio, and the nature of paper manufacturing in general. And Cole had waded through all of this with perfect patience until Horace finally paused to take a breath. And Cole had said, very quietly and with a completely straight face, that he assumed the paper had simply not wanted to come to Dusty Creek, which was a feeling Cole found entirely understandable. It was not, objectively speaking, a brilliant joke. It was the kind of remark that depended entirely on timing and delivery, and a certain shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of small-town life, and it landed in the room with the characteristic silence that Cole's humor almost always produced. Horace looked at him with mild confusion. The other customer who had been receiving the lengthy explanation about paper simply turned back toward the shelves, and Maggie Calloway laughed. Not a polite, obligatory little sound, but a real laugh, sudden and bright, the kind that came from genuine surprise and genuine amusement and couldn't be stopped even if you'd wanted to. She pressed her fingers briefly over her mouth as though to contain it, and then gave up and let it be what it was, and the sound of it in Horace Beale's dusty, cluttered general store was so unexpectedly warm that Cole felt something shift in his chest in a way he could not immediately explain and was not prepared to examine. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a moment where neither of them said anything, and then she said, still smiling, that she had had the same thought herself on more than one occasion, and that it was reassuring to know she wasn't alone in it. He said his name was Cole Hargrove, and that he worked out at the Rocking H. She said her name was Maggie Calloway, and that her father ran the newspaper. He said he had seen the paper. She asked what he thought of it. He said it was the most honest thing he had read in some time, which was less of a compliment to the paper specifically, and more of an observation about the general state of honesty in print. She said that was either a very kind thing to say or a very sad commentary on the world, and he said he saw no reason why it couldn't be both. She laughed again, smaller this time, and said she supposed he had a point. Horace returned with the news that the paper was still not available but could be ordered again, and the ordinary business of the morning resumed, and Cole collected Pete's tobacco and touched the brim of his hat and left the store, and the whole exchange had lasted perhaps 8 minutes. But he thought about it all the way back to the Rocking H, which was 6 miles along a road that was really just 2 ruts in the earth. And he was still thinking about it when he arrived at the ranch and handed Pete his tobacco and sat down on the fence of the near corral to watch Fletcher graze. There was something about the way she had laughed that had lodged itself somewhere in him, not just the fact of it but the quality of it, the immediacy of it, the sense that she had found the thing funny not because she was trying to be friendly or flirtatious, but simply because she genuinely had. It was the most honest response he had received from another human being in a considerable amount of time, and it did something to a man, being heard like that. Pete came and leaned on the fence beside him, and said he looked like a man thinking too hard about something that didn't require that much thinking. Cole said he was just watching the horse. Pete said the horse wasn't doing anything interesting enough to justify the look on Cole's face. Cole said nothing. Pete said, after a pause, that whoever she was, he hoped she was worth the trouble. Cole told him to go rest his knees. He went back to town 3 days later, which was sooner than he strictly needed to go but not so soon as to be conspicuous, or so he told himself. He had a genuine reason, which was that Edwin had asked him to stop by the feed merchant to check on a delivery, and he performed this errand efficiently and professionally. And then he found himself walking past the newspaper office, which was a small building on the eastern side of Main Street with a sign in the window that read Dusty Creek Courier, Thomas Calloway, editor. The front door was open because the autumn days were still warm enough to want the air moving through, and he could hear through the open door the rhythmic sound of a printing press in operation. He stood at the doorway for a moment and then knocked on the open door frame, which felt slightly foolish but seemed like the right thing to do, and Maggie appeared from behind a large press machine, wiping her hands on a cloth, with a smudge of ink on her left cheekbone and her hair in the usual state of partial escape from its pins. She looked at him with the kind of open, direct attention that was already beginning to feel characteristic of her, like she was genuinely interested in whoever was standing in front of her and not performing the interest. He said good afternoon, and that he was sorry to interrupt. She said he wasn't interrupting anything that couldn't wait a moment and asked what she could do for him. He said he had actually just stopped in to say good afternoon, which he recognized sounded strange. She looked at him for a second and then said it didn't sound strange at all, just honest, and that she could use more of both around here. She gestured at a chair near the front counter and said he could sit if he liked. He sat. She pulled up a stool on her side of the counter. And they talked for nearly an hour, in the way that conversations sometimes unfold when two people discover that the other one is genuinely interesting, moving from topic to topic in that organic, slightly breathless way where you keep finding new things you want to ask or say before you've finished the previous thought. They talked about the paper and its ambitions and limitations. They talked about the town and its particular character. She asked him where he had come from before Dusty Creek, and he told her about the cattle drives and the time in New Mexico and the stint as a deputy in Carterville. and she listened in the way that people listen when they are actually storing what you say rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. He asked about Tennessee, and she talked about her childhood there with a warmth and a slight wistfulness that told him she had loved it even if she didn't regret leaving. She talked about her father's dream of the newspaper, and about how she had thought of it initially as his dream and not hers, but had gradually discovered it was hers too. At one point during this conversation, Cole said something about the nature of news in small towns, a quiet observation about how in a small town the news was always really just the story of the same handful of people told in slightly different configurations, like a play with a permanent cast that kept getting different scripts. She stared at him for a second and then laughed again, and he felt the same shift in his chest as before, only stronger this time because he had had 3 days to understand that what he was feeling was not a passing thing. He walked back to the rocking H that evening in a state that he could not have described precisely, but that involved a persistent lightness behind his sternum that was unfamiliar and not unwelcome. He went back to town the following week, and the week after that, and each time he contrived a reason that was genuine enough to satisfy his own sense of dignity, though he suspected Maggie knew perfectly well by the third visit that the reasons were secondary. She was always glad to see him, or at least she seemed to be, in the straightforward way she had of showing things on her face. She did not flirt in the conventional sense, did not perform a performance, did not do any of the things that some women in that time and place did to signal interest, which were often things that managed to simultaneously indicate interest and obscure the actual person. Maggie simply talked to him as though he was worth talking to, listened as though what he said mattered, and laughed when he said something that struck her as genuinely funny, which happened with a frequency that he found remarkable. The laughter was the thing that kept undoing him, that specific, particular laugh, not because he was starved for approval but because of what it meant, that she was actually there in the conversation with him, that she was finding the same angles of things funny that he found funny, that their minds were touching the same points. He had talked to women before, had even been fond of a few of them, but he could not remember a single instance in his 28 years of a woman laughing at his jokes like that. Not the polite almost laughter of social courtesy, not the performative laughter of flirtation, but the real thing, involuntary and immediate. He told Pete about her one evening in early October, partly because Pete was going to figure it out anyway, and partly because he needed to say it out loud to understand what he actually thought. Pete listened with the patience of a man who had lived long enough to recognize a specific kind of story when he heard it and who knew better than to make a production of it. When Cole finished, Pete was quiet for a moment and then said that it sounded to him like Cole had found something important and that he had better not be an idiot about it. Cole said he was doing his best. Pete said that for most men their best was not good enough on these matters, and that Cole had better aim higher than that. It was in October, on a Tuesday when the air had turned cool and sharp, and smelled of coming rain, that Cole arrived at the newspaper office to find Maggie not behind the press but sitting at the front counter with an expression that was trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. Her father, Thomas Calloway, was ill. He had been ill in a gradual, persistent way for some time, a cough that had been getting worse since spring, and the doctor, a man named Ambrose Garrett who was competent and honest, had told them that week that it was a serious lung condition and that Thomas would need to rest significantly and reduce his workload if he was going to manage it at all. Thomas Calloway was 61 years old and had the constitution of a man who had spent his life in indoor labor, not physically weak but not built for frontier harshness either, and the dust of Dusty Creek, the fine constant grit that got into everything including the lungs of everyone who lived there, had been working on him in ways that the Tennessee air would not have. The doctor was clear that complete rest was not optional but an absolute necessity. This meant that Maggie was now running the newspaper entirely on her own. The typesetting, the writing, the editing, the printing, the delivery, the advertisements, the accounts, all of it. She was doing it without complaint, because complaint was not in her nature, but Cole could see, sitting across the counter from her on that Tuesday in October, that she was carrying something very heavy and had been carrying it alone for some time. He didn't say the obvious things that people said in these situations, the reassurances that sounded kind but felt hollow. He said that he was sorry about her father, and meant it simply, and then he asked what needed doing. She looked at him with slight surprise, as though she had expected the reassurances and not the practical question. He said he had grown up around a printing shop, which was true. His uncle in Missouri had run a small press, and Cole had spent 2 summers there as a boy, and that he wasn't a typesetter, but he could carry and lift, and do whatever the physical work required. He said he had Sundays free, and that Edwin had said he could come into town on Thursday afternoons if he wasn't needed at the ranch, and that if she needed an extra set of hands he was offering his. She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding whether to accept, which he knew was not simple because accepting help meant acknowledging that you needed it, and Maggie Calloway was not the type to do that easily. Then she said yes and thank you, and that she would appreciate it very much. He came that Thursday and the 2 Thursdays after and every Sunday through October and into November. The work was genuine and unglamorous, hauling paper, cleaning the press components, carrying the completed papers on the delivery route through town, running supplies, and sitting with Thomas Calloway on the days the older man was well enough to be up and wanting company. Thomas was a sharp, warm, talkative man who had clearly passed his fundamental character down to his daughter intact, and he approved of Cole with the directness of a man who did not see the point in concealing his opinions. He told Cole, one Thursday afternoon when Maggie had stepped out to make a delivery, that his daughter had more good sense than the average 4 people combined, and that whoever was going to be worth her time would need to be a person of genuine substance and not just impressive surface. Cole said he understood. Thomas looked at him carefully and said he believed he did. The thing between Cole and Maggie deepened in the way that things deepen when they are built on actual knowledge of a person, rather than on the projected fantasy of what you hope they might be. He learned that she had strong opinions about the responsibility of a newspaper to tell difficult truths even when comfortable lies would be easier, and that she had already written 2 pieces for the Courier that had caused local friction. One about the treatment of a Mexican family who had been run off land they had held for years by a group of Anglo settlers using legal intimidation, and one about the wages paid to the Chinese workers who had come through laying rail and been left stranded when the contract ended. These were not safe pieces to publish in 1878 Texas, and Cole knew it, and the fact that she had published them anyway told him something essential about who she was. She learned that he was a man who was fundamentally committed to what was right over what was convenient, which was a rarer quality than it sounded, and that he carried a quiet grief for the Carterville deputy's position that had ended when the town dissolved, not for the loss of the job specifically, but for the loss of having had something meaningful to do, of having been part of a place. She learned that he was genuinely funny in the way that only intelligent people who observe the world closely are funny, and that his humor was never cruel, never at someone else's expense, but always pointed at the absurdity of situations and systems rather than at the people caught within them. They had their first real argument in November, over something that seemed small in retrospect but felt enormous in the moment, which is often the way of first arguments between people who are beginning to matter to each other. A rancher named Douglas Pruitt had placed an advertisement in the Courier, a large and expensive advertisement for his cattle operation, and had subsequently come to Maggie with the suggestion, delivered in the oily manner of a man who believed money conferred rights over people, that perhaps the paper might consider being more favorable in its coverage of land dispute matters in the county, given his ongoing advertising relationship. Maggie had told him that the paper's editorial decisions were not for sale at any price, and Pruitt had withdrawn his advertisement, which represented a meaningful portion of the Courier's monthly income. Cole heard about this from Thomas, not from Maggie, and when he next saw her, he said that he thought she had been right to refuse, but that he was concerned about the financial strain on the paper and on her father's care, and he asked whether there was anything he could do. He said it carefully, but Maggie heard in it something that she perhaps was looking for at that moment, some suggestion that she had made a rash decision, and she said with more sharpness than she intended that she did not need to be managed. Cole said he was not trying to manage her, he was trying to help. She said that help offered in the tone of someone who thought you had made a mistake was not help, it was judgment with better manners. There was a silence. Then Cole said slowly that she was right and that he was sorry, that he had come at it wrong, and that he had no doubt she was right to refuse Pruitt, and that the paper was better for it. He said it with the particular quality of an apology that is genuine and not tactical, not the apology of a man trying to resolve an uncomfortable situation, but the apology of a man who had actually heard what she said and recognized the truth in it. She accepted it with the directness she brought to everything, said she was sorry too for the sharpness, and that she was tired and a little frightened about the money, and had let that come out sideways. He said he understood being frightened about things and trying to keep the fear somewhere it wouldn't get in the way. She said she imagined he did. After that, the thing between them was different, in the way things are different after a first real disagreement, more honest, more considered, more real. There is a kind of intimacy in arguing with someone and emerging from the other side of it still standing together, still liking each other, that is deeper than many pleasant exchanges. He kissed her for the first time in the second week of November. On the Thursday afternoon, he had walked her home from the newspaper office after a long working day. Her father's house was on the north side of town, a modest two-room structure that Thomas had added a small room to for Maggie, and they had stopped at the gate because that was where the walk ended, and there was no good reason to extend it further. And they had stood there talking for a few minutes in the way that people stand and talk when what they are really doing is not wanting to leave yet. And then there was a pause in the conversation, and Cole said, very quietly, that he would very much like to kiss her, and that he wanted to say so directly rather than just do it without asking. Maggie looked at him for a moment with those clear green eyes, and then said that she would very much like that too. And so he did, gently and briefly, with the November air cool around them and a horse somewhere down the street making a distant sound. When he stepped back, she was smiling in a way that she wasn't trying to control, the kind of smile that happens when you are too genuinely happy to manage your face. And he thought in that moment that he could not think of anything in his life that had felt more like arriving somewhere than this did. He rode back to the rocking H in the dark, and Pete was sitting on the bunkhouse porch, which Pete often did regardless of the hour or temperature, and Pete looked at him and said that it appeared his best had been sufficient after all. Cole said he supposed it had. Pete said good, and handed him a cup of coffee, and they sat in the November dark in companionable silence. He spoke to Thomas Calloway 2 Sundays later, which was the custom of the time and which also felt, in this case, simply right and honest, like a conversation that needed to happen. Thomas was in his chair by the stove, which was where he spent most of his days now, improving slowly but still not well, and he listened to Cole's careful, earnest statement of his intentions with the expression of a man who has been expecting something and is pleased to see it arriving in good order. Then he said that Maggie was her own person and her own authority, and that his blessing, while sincerely given, was a secondary matter to whether Maggie herself wanted it. Cole said he understood that and agreed with it. Thomas said in that case they were in accord, and that he was glad Cole had come to him, not because Maggie needed his permission, but because the conversation itself was a mark of good character. Then he asked Cole about his finances, which was a practical and reasonable question, and Cole answered it honestly, which was that his current savings were modest but his prospects at the Rocking H were stable, and that Edwin had suggested the possibility of a foreman position in the spring if things continued as they were. Thomas nodded and said that was sensible and that Maggie had never cared about money particularly, only about enough of it to do the work she wanted to do, and that he thought on that score Cole and his daughter would find themselves in agreement. Cole did not propose immediately because he was not the type of man to rush a thing that mattered, and because he wanted to be sure that when he asked in a way that Maggie would know was about her specifically, and not about the general proposition of a thing. He spent December at the Rocking H through the cold weeks of winter work, coming into town on his appointed days, and the courtship had by now become understood in the town in the way that things in small towns become understood, known by everyone, discussed by everyone, and invested in by everyone as though it were a communal enterprise. Clara Hobbs, who ran the seamstress shop and was the town's primary social historian, had told 3 separate people that she had known it would happen from the moment she first saw them together, which was not strictly true, but was the kind of thing people say, and that becomes its own truth over time. The Rocking H Christmas was a modest affair, Edwin Holly's being a practical rather than celebratory man, but he gave his hands the day off and a small bonus, and a bottle of decent whiskey between the 4 of them. Pete gave Cole a piece of advice, unprompted, which was that a good woman was not a thing you handled carefully to avoid breaking her. She was a person you trusted with the truth of yourself and hoped she'd do the same, and that anything less than that was just 2 people being polite to each other in close proximity. Cole said that was the most Pete had ever said at one time, and Pete said he was making up for lost time, and that Cole should stop interrupting. Cole had his foreman conversation with Edwin Hollies in the first week of January, 1879, and it went, as Thomas Calloway had suggested it might, Edwin confirming that he wanted Cole to take on the foreman responsibilities in the spring at a wage that represented a meaningful increase. Cole thanked him and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing falling into place. He asked Maggie to marry him on a Sunday afternoon in mid-January, not with any elaborate staging, but in the most genuine way he knew, which was to ask her directly while they were sitting in the newspaper office after spending the morning helping her prepare the week's edition. She was re-inking the press and he was straightening the type trays, and he said her name and she looked at him, and he said that he had been wanting to ask her something for some time, and that he was not going to make a speech about it because she would see through a speech, and he would rather just say it plainly. He said he loved her, which he had not said before in those direct words, and that he wanted to be her husband if she was willing to have him, and that he understood the newspaper was her work and her life, and he would never ask her to diminish it, only to let him be beside her in it. Maggie put down the ink brush. She looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once, happiness and recognition, and something that might have been the quiet relief of a person who has been hoping for a thing without quite admitting it. She said that she loved him too, which she also had not said before in those words, and that yes, she would marry him, and she said it with the same directness she brought to everything, no hesitation and no performance, just the clean truth of it. He crossed the small space between them and took her hands, ink-stained as they were, and held them, and she smiled at him with those green eyes clear and bright, and he thought he had never in his life been so precisely in the right place. Thomas Calloway, when told, cried in the way of men who pretend they are not crying, which involved a great deal of looking away and clearing of the throat and declarations that the air was very dusty today. He clasped Cole's hand and held it for a long moment and said he was glad his daughter had found someone who knew what she was worth. Cole said she would always know. The wedding was set for April, which gave time for the spring to come and for Thomas to continue improving, which he was doing slowly but genuinely, the doctor saying that the rest had been helping, and that with continued care he might have many more years. It gave time for Cole to begin the foreman responsibilities, and to establish himself more solidly at the rocking H. It gave time for the town to enjoy the anticipation of it, which a town of 400 people does with considerable enthusiasm. The months between January and April were among the best that Cole could remember in his life. Not dramatic or extraordinary, but deeply good in the way of ordinary days, lived with the knowledge that something fine is coming, and with someone beside you worth having beside you. He and Maggie spent their Thursday afternoons and Sundays together now without any pretense of it being about errands or practicality, simply choosing to be in the same place. And in the choosing, there was a kind of freedom that formality had kept at a distance. They argued sometimes, as they had established they were capable of doing, about things that mattered to one or both of them, and they worked through those arguments with the same directness and honesty they brought to everything else, and after each one they were closer than before. She showed him what she was writing for the paper before it went to print, which was a kind of trust she hadn't given anyone before, and he was a good reader, careful and honest in his responses, telling her when something was working, and when it wasn't without the softening that would have made his opinion useless. She sometimes changed things based on what he said, and sometimes disagreed with him and didn't change anything, and in both cases she thanked him for the engagement. He told her things about his life that he hadn't told other people, the specific texture of growing up in Missouri with a mother who had worked herself to early death, and a father who had meant well but was consistently absent in all the ways that mattered. The way the cattle drives had felt like freedom, and also like running. The quiet devastation of watching Carterville empty out after the mine collapse. The particular loneliness of being a man who observes the world carefully, and finds no one who is looking at the same things in quite the same way. She listened in the way she always listened, with her full attention, and what she said in response was not comfort for its own sake but engagement, as though what he had told her had given her something to think about, and she was thinking about it seriously. She said she thought loneliness was not the same as being alone, that loneliness was about not being seen, and that being alone was simply geography, and that she suspected Cole had spent a great deal of time in the first kind without necessarily living in the second kind. He said that was exactly right, and that he had never heard it put that way before. She said she had had a lot of time to think about things working alone in a print shop. He said the print shop's loss was his considerable gain. She laughed, and there it was, that laugh, and his chest did the familiar thing, and he thought that he would never stop loving the sound of that. April arrived, and with it a week of unexpectedly warm weather that felt like a gift from the particular geography of southwest Texas, which could be brutal but occasionally remembered to be beautiful. The Dusty Creek Church was small, but Clara Hobbs had been organizing the decorations for 2 months, and the result was that the plain wooden interior was transformed with sprigs of early wildflowers and lengths of white muslin into something genuinely lovely. Edwin Hollies gave Cole the morning off with the gruff observation that if he couldn't manage time off for his own wedding, then Edwin had failed to run a proper operation. Pete Dawson, who had pressed his best shirt for the occasion with a seriousness that suggested the shirt understood the weight of the day, stood beside Cole at the front of the church and did not say anything philosophical or instructive, simply stood there solid and quiet, which was more useful. Maggie came down the short aisle on her father's arm, which was the first time Thomas Calloway had been strong enough to walk any distance in months, and the effort it had cost him was visible in the slight pallor of his face and the careful way he moved, and the pride on his face was visible in a way that had nothing careful about it at all. Maggie was wearing a dress of deep blue, not the conventional white of Eastern fashion, but the color she had chosen because it was her choice, and she was not a woman who wore colors she hadn't decided to wear. And in it, She was the most beautiful thing Cole had ever seen, not because of the dress particularly, but because of the look on her face, which was open and clear and entirely herself. Reverend Marsh conducted the ceremony with the kind of warm practicality that the frontier required of its clergy. No excessive ornamentation but genuine feeling. And when he asked if Cole took Maggie to be his wife, Cole said he did in a voice steady and clear. And when he asked Maggie, she looked at Cole and said she did in the same direct tone she brought to everything, and then smiled in a way that the Reverend would later say was the most unambiguous yes he had witnessed in 30 years of performing marriages. The celebration afterward was at the Lucky Strike, which closed its bar for the afternoon and opened its floor to the community, and virtually the entire 400 people of Dusty Creek attended at some point, which meant the building was at serious capacity for several hours, and the noise was considerable. Someone had a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and there was dancing that ranged from the graceful to the enthusiastic, to the frankly alarming, and food that the women of the town had contributed with the competitive generosity of people who take public feeding seriously. Thomas Calloway sat in the best chair that could be found, looking like a man whose life had arranged itself into something satisfying, and received visitors with the courtly warmth of a man in his element. Cole danced with his wife, which was the first time he had used that word in his mind, and it arrived with a warmth he hadn't fully anticipated. And Maggie danced the way she did everything, with full commitment and no self-consciousness. And at one point during a faster number she laughed at something he said in her ear, and he felt the familiar shift in his chest, and thought that he had been right, months ago, that it would never stop doing that to him. Pete asked Maggie to dance, which she accepted with genuine pleasure, and Pete was, in fact, a remarkably good dancer for a man with troublesome knees, and afterward Pete came and stood beside Cole and said he supposed that this was what good looked like, and Cole said he supposed it was. Pete said he was glad for it. Cole said so was he. They had rented the small house on Birch Street that had been vacant since the previous autumn, a 4-room structure that needed some work but was sound and decent. And after the celebration they walked to it together through the April evening, the town quiet around them, the air still warm and carrying the smell of the plains grasses beginning their spring growth. Cole had put a lamp in the window before the ceremony so they would come home to light, which was a small thing but which Maggie noticed and said was the kindest kind of thought, the kind that anticipated what a moment might need. They settled into the life of Dusty Creek as a married couple with the ease of two people who had already decided the most important things about each other, and found they agreed. Cole took up the foreman responsibilities at the Rocking H, with the quiet competence that Edwin Hollies had chosen him for, managing the 4 hands and the seasonal workers, and the 101 decisions that a working cattle ranch required with a steadiness and fairness that earned him the respect of the men he supervised. He was never the type of foreman who ruled by volume or by making himself large. He was the type who knew what needed doing and made sure it got done, and trusted the people he was working with to be capable if given the chance to be. Rafael Medina, who had never said more than was necessary, told him one afternoon that he was the best boss he had worked for, which from Rafael represented essentially the highest praise available. Maggie continued the Courier with the same conviction she had always brought to it, now with the additional stability of Cole's income providing a cushion that let her make the occasional editorial decision without the immediate terror of financial ruin. She hired a part-time helper, a 16-year-old boy named Henry Sims, who was quick and willing, and had an aptitude for the physical work of the press that more than made up for his lack of experience. And the paper began to grow incrementally in both quality and circulation, being picked up by several families in neighboring settlements who arranged to receive it by mail on the supply wagon. Thomas Calloway continued to improve through the spring and into the summer, the doctor cautiously optimistic, but clear that full recovery was not likely, and that he would need to maintain a measured pace indefinitely. Thomas accepted this with the philosophy of a man who has always believed that what you can do is more interesting than what you cannot, and he began writing again, not the full editorial workload but a column, a weekly piece about life and observation and history that he wrote from his chair by the window, and that became, quietly, the most read thing in the paper. The summer of 1879 brought with it several things that shaped the life of Dusty Creek in ways that the town would talk about for years. A cattle disease moved through the county in July, and Edwin Hollis's herd was affected less than many others in the region, largely because Cole had noticed the early signs of illness in 2 animals and acted immediately, quarantining them before the infection spread wider. And Edwin, who was not a demonstratively grateful man, shook Cole's hand and said that he had earned his wage 10 times over that week. Douglas Pruitt, the rancher who had tried to buy favorable coverage from the Courier, lost a significant portion of his herd and attributed it publicly to bad luck. And Maggie wrote a piece about the outbreak and the disease management practices that either helped or hurt a rancher's odds, which was accurate and factual, and made no mention of Pruitt by name, but whose implications were perfectly clear to anyone who knew the situation, which in Dusty Creek was everyone. In August, a group of drifters who had been causing trouble in the territory moved through the edge of the county, and there was a night when they came through Dusty Creek itself. 4 men looking for trouble in the specific way of men who have decided that a small town is beneath their concern, and that what they want from it they can take. They came into the Lucky Strike and created a situation that the saloon keeper, a man named Tom Dre, was not equipped to handle alone. Cole was in the saloon that evening, as he occasionally was, and he handled the situation in the way of a former deputy who has no desire for violence but is not afraid of it, with a calm and a clarity that made 2 of the 4 men decide they had other places to be, and resulted in the other 2 spending a night locked in the storage room behind the blacksmith's shop, until the county sheriff arrived the following morning. Maggie wrote about it in the paper with a characteristic precision that reported exactly what had happened and why, and included a piece on the broader pattern of itinerant violence in the territory and the inadequate responses of county-level law enforcement, and Cole read it when it came off the press and said it was the best thing she had written. She said he was biased. He said he was, but that didn't make him wrong. She laughed, and he was the happiest man in Dusty Creek. By October of 1879, when the first anniversary of their first meeting was approaching, Maggie told Cole that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen of the Birch Street house, where she was doing the accounts for the paper, and he had come in from the ranch still carrying the smell of horses and honest work, and she said it simply and directly as she always said things, and his response was to stand very still for a moment as the information arranged itself in him, and then to cross the room and hold her in a way that was different from how he had held her before, with something added to it that he didn't have words for but that she understood because she felt it too. He said he was going to be very good at this. She said she knew he was. He said he wasn't sure he knew anything about children. She said she wasn't sure she did either, but that they would figure it out together, and that she suspected he was better at things than he thought he was. He said she was the most reasonable person he had ever met. She said she had been called worse. He was attentive through her pregnancy in the way that felt natural to him rather than performed, not fussing or hovering, because she had made it clear early on that she found fussing more exhausting than helpful, but being present and noticing and adjusting without making a production of the adjustment. He took on more of the physical tasks around the house. He made sure that the walking she did for paper deliveries was shared with Henry Sims wherever possible. He sat with her in the evenings and read, and they talked about the child and the future and all the specific ordinary details of the life they were building. Thomas Calloway was, when informed, visibly emotional in the same way he had been at the wedding, with the averted eyes and the excessive throat clearing. And Maggie held his hand and said he was going to be a grandfather, and he said he was fully aware of that, and that she didn't need to look at him like that, and Maggie said she would look at him however she liked, and Thomas said yes. That was about right. The baby arrived on a Wednesday morning in May of 1880, delivered by Doc Garrett with the competent calm of a man who had done this many times, and with Pete Dawson pacing the street outside, with the intensity of a man personally invested in the outcome. Cole stayed at Maggie's side through the whole of it, holding her hand and being there in the particular way she needed him, not speaking much but completely present. And when the baby finally arrived and Doc Garrett announced that it was a boy and healthy and that Maggie was well, Cole felt something happen in him that was too large for any word he had access to. He looked at his son, wrinkled and extraordinary and completely new to the world, and then at his wife, tired and luminous and looking at the baby with an expression that was everything. And he thought that this was the room where everything that had mattered converged. The morning in Horace Beale's general store, the long rides back to the rocking H thinking about a laugh, the Thursdays and the Sundays, the argument about Pruitt and the apology and the understanding that had followed it. The January afternoon in the newspaper office with ink-stained hands, the blue dress in April, all of it had come to this room and this moment and this small, impossible face. They named him Thomas James Hargrove, Thomas for Maggie's father and James for Cole's father, which was an act of generosity toward a man who had not always earned it but whom Cole had made a private peace with at some point along the way. Thomas Calloway, upon meeting his grandson, held him with the particular reverence of a man who understands he is being handed something extraordinarily precious, and who wants to prove himself equal to the trust. He looked down at the baby and then at Cole and said, his voice rough with something, that he was going to try very hard to be here for a long time, and Cole said he was glad to hear it and he meant it. Young Thomas was, from the beginning, a peaceful and observant baby, which Maggie said must come from his father since she herself had been reportedly very loud as an infant, and Cole said he was relieved to have contributed something useful. She laughed, and the baby startled slightly at the sound, and then seemed to find it familiar and settled again, and Cole thought it was the finest thing he had ever witnessed. The summer of 1880 moved forward with all the business of life, the ranch and the paper, and the town and the growing child. Cole's foreman position had solidified into something central to the running of the rocking H. Edwin Holly's trusting his judgment on increasingly significant matters, and occasionally suggesting, in his gruff and indirect way, that the partnership might become something more formal in time. The Courier had reached a circulation that allowed Maggie to pay Henry Sims a proper wage, and to begin considering whether a second printer might eventually be warranted. The tensions that existed in the wider territory, the ongoing pressures on Mexican families, and the complicated and often unjust dynamics between Anglo settlers and the native peoples whose land the frontier was built upon, continued to create the kind of news that Maggie insisted on reporting honestly, even when honesty was uncomfortable. She wrote about a land case in the county where a Mexican family named Garza had been successfully intimidated off land they had farmed for decades, and she wrote it with the clear eye of someone who knew that what was legal was not always what was right, and that a newspaper's job was to say so. The piece caused friction with several advertisers and one very unpleasant visit from Douglas Pruitt, who was apparently involved in the land transaction. And Cole was at the office that afternoon and made it quietly clear to Pruitt that he had said what he had come to say and should now leave, which Pruitt did with the resentful compliance of a man who recognizes when his options have narrowed. Afterward, Maggie said that she could handle Pruitt herself. Cole said he knew she could, and that he hadn't been handling Pruitt for her. He had been standing in the room in case being stood next to was useful. She said that was a very careful distinction. He said he had spent considerable time getting it right. She looked at him, and then smiled in the way that meant she was not going to argue further, and that was the end of it. By the fall of 1880, Thomas Calloway's health had declined again, not dramatically but noticeably, the improvement of the previous year plateauing and then slowly reversing in the way the doctor had said it might. He was still writing his column, still sharp and engaged in everything around him, still himself in all the ways that mattered, but he was spending more days in his chair and fewer days anywhere else, and both Maggie and Cole were aware of the change without speaking of it constantly. They visited him several times a week, bringing the baby who was now 5 months old and had recently discovered that grabbing things was possible, and that this discovery was endlessly interesting. Thomas read to the baby from whatever was to hand, newspaper columns, cattle price reports, philosophical texts. It didn't matter. It was the sound of his grandfather's voice, and the baby seemed entirely content with it. Thomas Calloway died on a clear November morning in 1880, quietly and in his sleep, having told Maggie the night before that he was very proud of her, and that he was very glad she had come to Texas with him, and that he hoped she knew that the newspaper was only ever a vehicle for what he really cared about, which was leaving something true and honest in the world, and that she had done that and would keep doing it. He had shaken Cole's hand and held it, and said that Cole was the right person, and that he had known it from the beginning. Cole had said he was grateful for Thomas's trust, and that he would honor it for the rest of his life, and Thomas had said he knew, and that was why he could rest easy. Maggie grieved her father with the full depth of feeling that the loss warranted, and with the same honesty she brought to everything, not performing strength she didn't have but also not drowning in the grief, moving through it with the kind of courage that is not the absence of pain but the willingness to bear it. Cole was beside her through all of it, in the way she needed him to be, not trying to fix the unfixable but being present in the specific way she had learned to rely on and trust. And when she cried, he held her, and when she needed to work, he let her work, and when she laughed at some memory of her father, he laughed too, because Thomas Calloway had been genuinely funny, and funny deserved its full due. Thomas's column ran for 2 weeks after his death, pieces he had written and scheduled before he became too ill to work. The second to last one was about a spring afternoon in Tennessee when Maggie was 7 years old and had taken apart the kitchen clock to see how it worked and had then, remarkably, put it back together, and what that had told him about who she was going to be. The last column was about Dusty Creek specifically, about what it was and what it could become, about the possibility that places at the edge of the known world could become something worth becoming if the people in them chose to make it so. And it ended with a note that was as close to a goodbye as Thomas Calloway was constitutionally capable of making, which was to say it wasn't explicit but it was clear, and half of Dusty Creek wept reading it. Maggie framed that last column and hung it in the newspaper office, and it stayed there. The winter of 1880 going into 1881 was cold and still, and the kind of quiet that comes after a significant loss, not empty, but full of a different substance than before. Cole and Maggie and young Thomas moved through the cold months with a closeness that had been deepened by grief and by the business of caring for a baby through a Texas winter, and by all the small daily things that constitute a life being lived. The baby became more himself every week, more animated and specific, showing early signs of a personality that combined Maggie's directness with something that might have been Cole's dry observational quality, though Cole said it was too early to determine that, and Maggie said she was the editor, and she knew how to read things. In February of 1881, Edwin Hollies came to Cole with a proposal that he had been building toward for some time, which was to take Cole on as a true partner in the Rocking H, a meaningful ownership stake in exchange for the foreman work of the past 2 years, and a continuation of that work going forward. Edwin was 63 and had no children, and had been running the operation alone for over a decade, and he was honest enough to acknowledge that he needed a succession plan, and practical enough to recognize that Cole was it. They negotiated the terms over several evenings at Edwin's kitchen table, straightforwardly and fairly, and came to an agreement that both of them felt was right, and shook hands on it. And Cole rode home that night feeling the solid ground of something substantial under his feet. He told Maggie over dinner that evening, and she listened to the whole of it and asked several precise questions about the terms and the financial structure, which were exactly the right questions, and then she said it was a very good thing and that she was proud of him. He said he wasn't sure proud was quite the right word. She said she was the editor and she was very sure it was, and he smiled and said he supposed she would know. Spring came back to Dusty Creek in 1881 with its usual combination of wind and wildflowers, and the sense of perpetual possible renewal that the season carries everywhere, but that carries a particular weight on the frontier, where winter is harder and the return of warmth is more felt. Young Thomas was walking, or attempting it with the particular lurching determination of a child who has decided that this is the thing and has not yet fully worked out the mechanics, and the house on Birch Street was noisier and more complicated and more alive than it had ever been. Pete Dawson left the Rocking H in April of 1881, his knees finally having convinced him that they were done with hard ranch work, and he went to live with his sister in a town called Mercy, 3 days' ride south. His leaving was the end of an era in the small world of the Rocking H, and Cole felt it as a loss even though he understood it was entirely right. Pete had been, in a way he had never made explicit, one of the good constants of Cole's time in Dusty Creek, steady and honest and capable of the specific kind of friendship that doesn't require much tending, but holds absolutely firm when it's needed. Cole shook his hand and said he was going to miss him, and Pete said he was going to miss Cole's attempts at humor, which had gotten marginally better over 3 years, and that the attempts themselves had always been more entertaining than the actual jokes. Cole said that was either a compliment or an insult, and Pete said it was both and that Cole should figure out which was which. Then he rode south, and Cole watched him go and turned back to the work. Rafael Medina was promoted to the senior hand position vacated by Pete's departure, and the 2 new men hired in the spring were young and capable, and the Rocking H moved into the 1881 season with the particular strength of an operation that has found its rhythm. Maggie announced in the early summer of 1881 that they were expecting again, and Cole's response this time was immediately warm rather than requiring a moment of adjustment. He knew now what this news meant in its fullness, the difficulty and the enormity and the extraordinary thing of it. He held her in the kitchen on a June evening with young Thomas attempting to climb his father's boot, and said that the Birch Street house was going to get quite full. Maggie said that was the general intention. He said he was very glad of it. She said so was she. The Courier that summer published a significant series of pieces that Maggie had been working on for months, an investigation into the land grant system in the county, and the patterns of legal manipulation being used to dispossess Mexican families and other long-established settlers of land they had legitimate claim to. The research had been careful and the facts were solid, and the pieces were written with the controlled precision that Maggie brought to things that mattered most to her, not inflammatory but impossible to dismiss. The series created a significant response in the county, and eventually drew the attention of a newspaper in San Antonio, which reprinted portions with credit, and the Dusty Creek Courier became briefly known in a wider world than its 400 immediate subscribers. There was some local pushback, including a period in August when Maggie received several anonymously written letters that were threatening in tone, and Cole read these and was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding how to respond, and then said that she needed to know about these, but that they were the response of men who knew they had been accurately described and had no good answer to that, and that the best response to intimidation was to keep going, but that he also wanted the county sheriff to know about the letters. Maggie agreed to that, and the sheriff, a reasonable man named Carver, came and looked at the letters and said he would be watchful, and nothing further came of it. Cole was watchful through that period in a way that didn't burden Maggie with it, but that was real, and she knew it was real, and the knowledge of it was one of those small, constant things that accumulate into the substance of deep trust between people. He was not protective in the way that suffocated, not the type who saw her capability as something to be managed. He was protective in the way of someone who would stand between a person they loved and harm if the moment required it, and who trusted that the moment was unlikely to require it if the work was done carefully, but who was there regardless. The second child was born in January of 1882. A girl this time, arrived on a cold, bright morning with an energy that was perceptible from the first moment, a loud and definitive presence in contrast to young Thomas's early quiet. They named her Clara Rose Hargrove, Clara for Clara Hobbs, who had been, for all her social chronicling, genuinely kind to Maggie from the first days of her arrival in Dusty Creek, and Rose because it was simply a beautiful name, and they felt she had the right to carry it. Young Thomas, at nearly 2 years old, approached his sister with the cautious curiosity of a child, encountering a new and somewhat alarming phenomenon, circling at a respectful distance for several days before deciding she was acceptable, and then becoming fiercely attached in the way of older siblings who have made a careful judgment and stand fully behind it. Cole watched this process with the particular pleasure of a man who had grown up alone and was watching his children not be alone, and said to Maggie one evening that Thomas's verdict on his sister had been worth waiting for. Maggie said it was because Thomas did not make assessments quickly, which she said was exactly like his father. Cole said he chose to take that as a compliment. She said it was, entirely. The winter of 1882 was cold, and the ranch work was harder. Several cattle lost to the worst freeze in years, and Cole worked through it with the steady focus of someone who has learned that the things outside your control are only wasted energy to resent, and the things inside your control are where the work lives. Edwin Hollies was slowing visibly now, his age showing in the way of men who have been hard workers and find that hard work has a reckoning at the end, and he relied on Cole's judgment on all but the most significant decisions, and even on those mostly agreed with what Cole had already thought. Spring of 1882 came with the particular sweetness that follows a hard winter, as though the earth is making a specific restitution. The children grew and were themselves with increasing conviction, Thomas speaking in complete and precise sentences that startled adults meeting him for the first time, Clara conducting herself with the absolute certainty of a child who has assessed the world and found it satisfactory and intends to keep it that way. Maggie was 30 years old that spring and was in the fullness of what she was, the newspaper stronger than it had ever been, her writing more confident and more true. The woman she was at 24 expanded and deepened by everything the years had brought into something that Cole, who had spent these years beside her and was therefore not the most objective witness, thought was extraordinary. He told her this on a Sunday afternoon in April while they were sitting on the porch of the Birch Street house in the warm spring air, the children playing in the dirt of the yard, with the wholehearted absorption of small people for whom the present moment is the entire world. He said he wanted her to know that the last 4 years were the best of his life and that he expected the next 40 to be better. She looked at him with those green eyes in the afternoon light and said he was getting better at saying things. He said he had had a good teacher. She said she hoped the student would continue to apply himself. He said he was deeply committed to the curriculum. She laughed that laugh, all these years later still exactly itself, still doing the same thing to his chest that it had done the first time in Horace Beale's general store, warm and immediate and entirely genuine. He reached over and took her hand and she let him, their fingers interlaced in the easy, specific way of people who have learned the exact fit of their hands together. Down in the yard, Thomas was instructing Clara in something with great seriousness, and Clara was listening with a patience that she would not have shown anyone else. The afternoon light was the gold of Texas Springs, and somewhere on the edge of town a horse was moving at a canter, and the smell of cooking from a neighbor's house was in the air, and it was completely ordinary, and it was the most beautiful thing Cole Hargrove had ever seen. He thought about Horace Beale's general store. He thought about the moment the joke landed, and the silence, and then the laugh, sudden and real and warm, the only honest response he had received to anything in a very long time. He thought about riding back to the rocking H 6 miles in the dust, thinking about a woman he had spoken to for 8 minutes and knowing, even then, that something had changed. He thought about the Thursdays and the November kiss at the gate, and the January afternoon, with the ink-stained hands and the blue dress and Thomas Calloway crying at the wedding while claiming it was dusty, and the first night in the Birch Street house with the lamp in the window, and the May morning when Thomas was born and the world remade itself around a small face, and all of it, every ordinary, extraordinary day of it, had begun because she laughed at a joke that no one else had found funny. She had laughed, and he had heard himself for the first time in years, and he had never forgotten it, and he never would. He said, very quietly, that he still thought about that morning in the general store. Maggie looked at him with the particular smile that was his and only his, the one that had nothing performed about it, and said she did too. He asked if she had known that morning that something was beginning. She said she hadn't known, but she had felt it, which was different, and that she had thought about it the rest of that day and wondered if she would see him again. He said he had thought about it the whole 6 miles back to the ranch, and had decided to be in town again 3 days later on the thinnest pretext available. She said she had noticed the pretext was thin. He said he had hoped it wasn't that obvious. She said it was entirely obvious and that she had found it wonderful. He laughed then, which was still less frequent than her laughter but more present than it had been 4 years ago, and she turned to look at him and said it was a good sound and that he should do it more. He said she would have to keep providing the material. She said she would do her best. He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles, ink-stained even today because Maggie Calloway was always the woman with ink on her hands, and he loved that about her. And she leaned her head against his shoulder in the afternoon light with the children playing in the yard below them. Edwin Hollis passed the Rocking H partnership into its formal arrangement later that year, a legal document drawn up by the county's single lawyer that made Cole Hargrove a genuine partner in a cattle operation that encompassed 2,000 acres of Texas land, and a herd that, managed well, represented a serious and stable livelihood. Edwin retired to a smaller house in Dusty Creek itself, close enough to advise when asked, and far enough to let Cole run things without the weight of the founder standing over every decision. He came for Sunday dinner at the Birch Street house regularly, a large, gruff, now somewhat softened old man who ate Maggie's cooking with sincere appreciation and spoke very little but seemed entirely content, and who had clearly decided that Cole's family was the closest thing to his own that he was going to have, and that this was sufficient. Clara Hobbs threw a party in the fall of 1882 to celebrate the Hargroves' combined achievements, the Courier's expanded circulation, the Rocking H partnership, the general excellent state of a family that the town had collectively watched become itself, and half of Dusty Creek attended, and the other half heard about it in sufficient detail the following week to feel they had also been present. Cole stood in the Lucky Strike on that autumn evening, his wife beside him and his children at the edge of the dancing, Thomas watching everything with his customary careful attention, and Clara conducting herself as though the party had been arranged specifically for her, which, given Clara's relationship with the world, was a reasonable interpretation. Cole looked at his life. He looked at Maggie, who was talking to 3 different people simultaneously in the way she had of giving everyone the full quality of her attention, her red hair more properly up than usual but already beginning its characteristic escape. And she looked over at him in the middle of her conversation and caught him looking and smiled in that particular way, the way that was his, and he smiled back in the way that was hers. He had come to Dusty Creek with a bedroll and a horse, and the particular kind of alone that comes from moving through the world without being seen by anyone in the specific way that matters. He had told a joke in a general store, and nobody had laughed except one woman with green eyes and ink on her fingers, and a directness that immediately made everything else feel like performance by comparison. And from that single, ordinary, extraordinary moment, the whole of it had unfolded. The work and the house and the children and the partnership and the years of Thursdays and the lamp in the window and all of it rooted in that laugh. He crossed the room to her, and she finished her conversation, and turned to him, and he said, without preamble, that he loved her, and that he intended to keep saying so on a regular basis for the foreseeable future. She said she was glad to hear it because she loved him too, and that she planned to hold him to the regular basis. He offered her his hand for the next dance, and she took it, and they danced in the Lucky Strike on a fall evening in 1882, while their children watched from the edge of the floor, and Edwin Hollies sat in the corner looking like a man at peace, and the fiddle played something warm, and the light was gold, and all of Dusty Creek was gathered in the room. Young Thomas watched his parents dance with the serious attention he brought to things he found important, and at some point he turned to Edwin Hollies, who was sitting beside him, and asked why his father always smiled when his mother laughed. Edwin looked at the boy for a moment, this precise small person asking a precise question, and said he reckoned it was because she was the only one who laughed at his jokes, and that a man never forgot something like that. Thomas considered this with the seriousness it deserved, and then said that seemed like a good reason. Edwin said he thought so too. Clara, next to Thomas, was not listening to any of this because she had identified someone across the room who appeared to have cake and had begun strategic movement in that direction, which was entirely characteristic, and which both Thomas and Edwin Hollies watched with what might have been admiration. On the dance floor, Cole Hargrove held his wife's hand and moved to the fiddle music, and she said something quietly in his ear, and he laughed, fully and openly, and the sound of it joined everything else in the room, the music and the voices and the children and the life of a town on the edge of the frontier, ordinary and extraordinary, exactly as it should be. Outside, Dusty Creek was quiet in the fall night, the stars enormous over the Texas plain in the way that stars are enormous in places where there is nothing to diminish them. The Lucky Strike sent warm light out across the unpaved street. Somewhere on the edge of town, a coyote called once and was quiet. The night was clear and cool and smelled of the plains and the coming winter that would come and go and give way to another spring, and another year, and another decade, as the years do, carrying with them the ordinary, extraordinary weight of a life being fully, honestly, and well lived. Inside, the music played on, and Cole Hargrove danced with the woman who had laughed at his joke, and she was still the only one, and he had never forgotten, and he never would.